The desert stretched endlessly under the inky black sky, a barren wasteland punctuated by the occasional scrubby bush or twisted Joshua tree. The road ahead was a ribbon of asphalt, illuminated only by the dim headlights of a beat-up, dust-covered car. Inside, the driver's hands gripped the wheel firmly, his knuckles white against the leather, as he sped through the desert night. The engine hummed, the tires thrummed against the cracked road, and the only sound inside the vehicle was the steady hiss of the air conditioner working overtime to fight off the oppressive desert heat. His name was Carter, and though anyone looking at him from a distance might have seen an ordinary man, the truth was far darker. Beneath his calm exterior, there was something rotten, something festering, a sickness that had taken hold of him long ago and never let go. Carter was a killer, and the desert was his hunting ground. He didn't know why he had chosen this life. He didn't bother with questions like that anymore. It was simply what he did, what he was out here in the silence of the open road. No one could hear the screams. No one could stop him. He had left a trail of bodies across 3 states, and he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Tonight, though, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though there was no one for miles. The night pressed in on him, thick and heavy, like a weight on his chest. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the road ahead, the distant horizon that seemed to shimmer under the glow of the moon. Then he saw him, a lone figure, standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched, illuminated briefly in the headlights before fading into the darkness behind the car. Carter's heart skipped a beat. A hitchhiker, out here in the middle of nowhere? It seemed too perfect, too easy. He could feel the familiar thrill of anticipation stirring in his gut. He pressed down on the brake, slowing the car to a stop a few yards ahead. In the rearview mirror, the figure began to jog toward the car, silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. Carter's pulse quickened as the man approached the passenger door and pulled it open. "You going far?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice low and raspy from what Carter assumed was hours of walking in the desert heat. The man was tall, with dark, unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He looked rough, like someone who had been out here for a long time, worn down by the elements. "Depends," Carter replied, his voice calm, betraying none of the excitement he felt. "Where are you headed?" The man shrugged as he climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. "Anywhere but here, I guess." Carter gave a slight nod and pressed his foot down on the gas, sending the car speeding forward once more. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the hitchhiker staring out the window as the desert blurred by, the lights of distant towns barely visible on the horizon. "What's your name?" Carter asked, breaking the silence. "Mark," the hitchhiker replied without looking away from the window. "And you?" "Carter." Mark nodded, still staring out into the night. For a while, neither of them spoke, the tension hanging in the air like the oppressive heat outside. Carter's mind raced. He was sizing the man up, trying to figure out how to play this. Should he wait until they were farther into the desert? Should he strike now, while Mark was distracted? But then, Mark spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You ever do anything you regret?" Carter's grip tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean?" Mark turned to face him, his eyes dark and hollow. "You know what I mean? You ever hurt someone?" For a moment, Carter considered lying, playing dumb. But something about Mark's tone, the way he asked the question, made him pause. There was something familiar in it, something that made his pulse quicken in a different way. "Maybe," Carter said carefully. "You." Mark smiled then, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down Carter's spine. "Maybe." The silence that followed was thick, the air in the car suddenly feeling too warm, too stifling. Carter's mind raced. Was Mark like him? Could it be possible? "I've done things," Mark said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Things that would make most people sick. But you're not like most people. Are you, Carter?" Carter's heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through his veins. "I guess not." Mark leaned back in his seat, his smile widening. "I knew at the moment you picked me up. You got that look, that feel about you. I've seen it before." Carter's mouth went dry. Was this real? Had he really just picked up another killer in the middle of the desert? Let me guess, Mark continued, his voice casual, as if they were discussing the weather. You like to pick them off the road, don't you? Hitchhikers, people who won't be missed. Easier that way. Carter didn't respond, but the look in his eyes must have given him away. Mark laughed, a dark, unsettling sound. I knew it. We're the same, you and me. For a moment, Carter didn't know how to react. He had always worked alone, always kept his dark urges hidden from the world. But now, sitting next to him in the passenger seat, was someone who understood. Someone who had done the same things he had. I've been doing this for years, Mark said, his tone conversational now, as if they were old friends. Started out small, like most of us do. But it gets bigger, doesn't it? The hunger, the need. Carter nodded, his throat tight. It's almost like a game, Mark continued. Seeing how long you can go, how far you can push it before someone catches on. They drove for hours like that, sharing stories, trading details of their kills, their methods. Carter found himself opening up in a way he had never done before, telling Mark about the first time he killed, about how easy it had been to make the bodies disappear out here in the desert. Mark, in turn, shared his own tales, laughing as he described the thrill of watching the life drain out of his victim's eyes. By the time they came across the second hitchhiker, it was as if they had known each other for years. She was standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, a backpack slung over one shoulder. She was young, in her early 20s maybe, with long dark hair and a look of desperation in her eyes. Carter slowed the car as they approached her, glancing over at Mark. Think she's another one? He asked, half joking. Mark shrugged. Only one way to find out. They pulled over, and the woman jogged up to the car, opening the back door and sliding into the seat behind them. Thanks for stopping, she said, her voice breathless. I've been out here for hours. No problem, Carter replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Where are you headed? Anywhere but here, she said, echoing Mark's earlier words. Carter and Mark exchanged a glance. There was something off about her, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. But for now, they said nothing, driving in silence once more. The night stretched on, the miles slipping away beneath the tires, the desert around them growing darker and more foreboding. Carter could feel the tension in the car rising, a sense of unease settling over them. Something wasn't right. They pulled into a rest stop sometime after midnight, the small, dimly lit parking lot empty except for a few scattered vehicles. Carter parked the car near the restroom building, turning off the engine. I'll be right back, he said, glancing at Mark. Mark nodded, watching him as he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows. Inside the restroom, Carter splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since they picked up the woman. Something about her was wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe he was imagining things. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake picking her up. When he returned to the car, Mark was gone. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, the parking lot eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the desert wind. Panic surged through him. Where had Mark gone? And where was the woman? Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, moving toward him with deliberate slowness. It was her, the woman, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the rest stoplights. Where's Mark? Carter demanded, his voice tight with fear. She smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile that sent a chill down his spine. He won't be coming back. Before Carter could react, she was on him, a blade flashing in the dim light. Pain exploded in his chest as the knife sank deep, and he stumbled backward, clutching at the wound. He tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat as the woman advanced, her eyes cold and predatory. Carter fell to the ground, the world around him spinning, the desert night, turning into a blur of pain and fear. He gasped for breath, his vision narrowing as blood poured from the wound in his chest. The woman stood over him, her knife gleaming in the faint light, a cruel smile twisting her lips. There was no hesitation in her movements, no flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had done this before, many times. Carter's mind raced, a flood of fragmented thoughts and regrets. How had this happened? How had he, Carter, the predator, become the prey? Just moments ago, he had felt invincible, sharing stories of his kills with Mark, confident in his power over life and death. Now, he lay on the ground, helpless, the life draining from him. The woman knelt beside him, her knife poised to strike again. "You really thought you were the only ones out here, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice soft and mocking. "Men like you always do. So confident, so sure of yourselves." Carter tried to speak, but the pain in his chest was too great. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling as the blood pooled beneath him. The woman leaned in closer, her face inches from his, her eyes glittering with something dark and twisted. "I've been hunting men like you for years," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so special, so clever. But you're not. You're just another monster in a world full of them. And I'm the one who cleans up the mess." Her words barely registered through the haze of agony that had consumed Carter. All he could focus on was the cold, hard reality that this was the end. He wasn't going to make it out of here. She was going to kill him, just as she had killed Mark. Mark! Carter's gaze flickered toward the shadows where Mark had disappeared. He hadn't even heard the struggle, hadn't known that his newfound companion had already met his end. A bitter realization settled over him. He had trusted Mark, just as he had trusted the wrong person in picking up this woman. The woman tilted her head, studying him with a twisted curiosity. "I bet you didn't see this coming, did you? You and your little friend thought you had the world figured out, that you could do whatever you wanted, take whoever you wanted. But you didn't count on me." She raised the knife again, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I always find the ones like you. It's what I do." Carter's hand twitched, his fingers brushing against something hard and cold, the handle of a small knife he kept hidden in his boot. He had always kept it there just in case, though he had rarely needed it. Now, in this moment, it was his only chance. Summoning the last of his strength, he gripped the handle and swung the blade upward, aiming for the woman's throat. The motion was weak, unsteady, but it was enough to startle her. She stumbled back, the knife grazing her shoulder as she cursed and leapt to her feet. "You little," she hissed, her voice dripping with fury. Carter tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His vision swam, darkness closing in around the edges. He could feel his life slipping away, every breath more labored than the last. The woman stood over him, her hand pressed to the shallow wound on her shoulder, her eyes burning with anger. "You're not going to make it," she snarled, her voice low and venomous. "But don't worry, I'll make sure your friend joins you soon enough." Carter's grip on his knife loosened as the strength drained from his body. He knew she was right. He wasn't going to make it. The world around him grew dimmer, the sounds of the desert fading into an eerie silence. His last thoughts were a mix of anger and regret, a bitter realization that in the end, he had been outmatched. The woman watched him for a moment longer, her expression cold and unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Carter to bleed out alone in the vast emptiness of the desert. The rest stop was silent again, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the scrubby bushes. The woman moved quickly and efficiently, her footsteps quiet as she approached the car where Mark lay slumped in the front seat, his throat neatly slit. He hadn't even seen it coming. He had been too busy watching Carter's slow return from the restroom to notice the glint of her knife. She smiled to herself as she wiped the blood from her hands and pulled Mark's body from the car, dragging it into the shadows. This had been easier than she expected. Two predators, thinking they were untouchable, brought down in a single night. It was almost too perfect. Once the bodies were disposed of, she rifled through the car, taking anything of value, cash, weapons, anything that might come in handy for the road ahead. Then, with the same cold efficiency, she cleaned the blood from the interior and started the engine. As the car roared to life, she glanced at the empty road ahead, her eyes narrowing in thought. This was just the beginning. There would be more like them. There always were. And she would find them, one by one. The woman shifted the car into gear, her expression unreadable as she sped off into the desert night, the road stretching out before her like a dark, endless void. Out there in the dead of night, she was the hunter, and the desert belonged to her.